Good morning, folks, and welcome to Worship at Home. I hope your week has gone well and that you found something productive to do, something that maybe has fed your spirit in some way. I want to remind you to check your email for the newsletter that we send out on Saturday each week. And during this time of being careful about being in too close a proximity to each other, all the worship resources are there in the newsletter for you. And hopefully you use those as part of your worship time, and that it will enhance that worship at home experience for you. I know it's not the same, but it's what we have to work with right now, and so I hope that it's meaningful for you. Verses 13 through 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" And they stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you does not know the things that have taken place there in these days? And he asked them, what things? And they replied, the things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. And they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. And they were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. May God add blessings to the reading and hearing and living of this holy word this day. As we come to this third Sunday of Easter, we find ourselves traveling on a road that might seem familiar. Every one of us at one time or another have walked this road. It is a road where we have lost our way, or a road that we have returned to walk again. And the road is the road to Emmaus. And along that road, maybe we have spoken words similar to what Cleopas and his friends spoke. Maybe these words have come to our lips as we traveled, we had hoped. We had hoped maybe the tumor wasn't malignant. We had hoped that our daughter would return home. We had hoped that we could keep our jobs. We had hoped to have a baby. We had hoped that the pandemic would spare our family. We had hoped for God to answer our prayer. We had hoped our faith would survive. The words spoken on the road to Emmaus are words of pain and disappointment and uncertainty and yearning. And they are words that we often say when we come to the end of our road, the end of our hopes and our dreams. When we come to that end of the road where we feel that nothing that we had hoped for would come true. And we feel defeated and lost and alone. But we had hoped. In our gospel story this week, Cleopas and his companions say these words. They were perhaps speaking them to one another as they walked and as they spoke them again when the stranger joins them on the road. And they said to this stranger, "We had hoped that he," meaning Jesus, "would be the one to redeem Israel." As far as they know, Jesus is dead. This man, this rabbi of theirs, this friend, this teacher, the one that they had staked their lives on, the one that they had hoped would be the Messiah, was dead. He was supposed to have been the one that would change the world for them. And instead, he died a most horrible and unimaginable death. And the promises that he made of a new kingdom coming had come to nothing. And to make matters worse, the tomb where they had buried his body was empty. His body was missing. And then there was the stories of the women who loved him and had followed him. It seems as if they had gone mad. They reported seeing angels and gardeners and talking to ghosts. Things couldn't have been worse. Things were falling apart. We had hoped, they said. According to Luke's gospel, the story happens on Resurrection Sunday, the same day that we usually in our history now as churches pack the churches with people and flowers and sing songs of hallelujahs. And even as we do that in our scripture, the road to Emmaus is stretching out in front of us. And in the midst of all the hallelujahs and all the celebrations, there's that road to travel that speaks of our disillusionment and our defeat. It's the story that tells us that even in the midst of joy and sorrow, whatever the case might be, that it's sometimes hard to see the risen Christ. This year, our Easter was really so different than what it had ever been before. And the COVID-19 crisis continues to interrupt our usual routines. But in the midst of the chaos and the uncertainty that we're living in right now, trying to avoid getting sick from one another, putting distance between ourselves, we still should be grateful for this post-resurrection story that reminds us that hope delayed is not hope denied. You see, the road to Emmaus is a sacred road. And on this road, we can acknowledge our disappointments, even as we should hold on to the knowledge that this road, in the midst of our disappointments, offers us possibilities of renewal and new life. And I guess this story of Jesus walking the Emmaus road with these disciples reminds us that Jesus is hardly ever who we think he might be, and is often not necessarily who we want him to be. Think about what happened. It was a quiet resurrection. Now we might think to ourselves, if God, who had suffered so much, such a violent death, an unjust death, would be resurrected, that he might come back with a vengeance, you could say, with a shout from the rooftops or some magnificent something to announce the resurrection. But Jesus doesn't do that. He doesn't go back to the temple and make an appearance. He doesn't go to the Pharisees. He doesn't go to Pilate's house. He doesn't call down angels or fire or any other outlandish things to make a point, to make the point that he has risen from the dead. And he doesn't do anything to avenge the cruel death that he suffered. Instead, Scripture tells us on the evening of his resurrection, he takes a walk. He takes a walk on an out-of-the-way road. And there in front of him are two travelers. And he quietly joins them in what seems to be a really unobtrusive way. He doesn't announce who he is. It seems interesting, they don't even ask his name. And it's made apparent to us that they don't recognize who he is. And as soon as Jesus begins to walk with them, he invites them to tell him their story. And he does that by asking the question, what are you discussing? And the scripture tells us that they were so astonished at this question that they stopped walking. I can imagine that they stare at him, maybe even with their mouths hanging open, because they cannot believe that he hasn't heard what has been going on, especially about the death of Jesus. And so they share their story with him. They share the story of their faith, of their joys, and their disappointments. And they share how they hoped Jesus would have been the Messiah. They thought so much of him that was what he would be. And they even say that we thought he would be a prophet, mighty in word before God and all the people. And then they describe their devastation at his death. And while they walk, they tell Jesus the whole story. And Jesus listens. And he allows them to tell this story. And certainly he knows that in allowing them to tell this story, to tell their story of their grief and their dashed hopes, that he was perhaps letting them heal a bit from the grief that they had suffered. And then when they finished their side of the story, Jesus tells them their story back to them, and in doing so, he changes the story. See, in Jesus' retelling of the story, it becomes what it always was, and maybe what they had forgotten it was, because Jesus fills in a lot and makes it more deeper and wiser and a richer story that they had forgotten. So when Jesus tells the story, he reminds them of the scriptural tradition, of the history, of all of those places where the story of Jesus has been revealed, even though they might not remember having seen it. And he helps these travelers in a way that's not even apparent to them to comprehend their place in the story. A place in the story that perhaps will allow them to replace their sadness and disappointment with something that's more joyful. Those travelers that day don't notice until later, but as Jesus is telling them the story again, their hearts are burning. They have a sensation that something different, something special is happening. The travelers that day had done what we often do in the midst of tragedy and disappointment. They had narrowed their view of the story. They had lost their sense of the big picture. And they, like us, had lost the ability to see the broader, more expansive content of what was happening. We're like the travelers that day. We need Jesus to meet us on our Emmaus road and weave a story for us that includes scripture and context and pattern and purpose, so that it puts our thinking back into perspective and widens the tiny narrative that we cling to in our disappointments. They said to Jesus, "We had hoped the story would be bigger. We had hoped for a better ending to the story." So when the travelers reached Emmaus, Jesus gives them the option to continue on without him. The scripture tells us that, in fact, he indicates that he's going on, he's branching off to continue the journey. So he puts in their hands the option. They have to decide, they have to be intentional about inviting Jesus to stay with them. Now, it doesn't tell us if they had to think about this for a moment. It does say that they insisted, because it was evening and it was time for dinner and it was dark, I'm sure, that they insist that he come and stay with them and eat with them. They're kind of brave, really, inviting a stranger into their home. But they do this. And I think they probably continue their conversation. Maybe that's exactly what drove them to invite Jesus to continue with them to their home. We might ask ourselves just for a moment, what would have happened if they had just let Jesus go? If they had said goodbye and allowed him to continue on the road? If they had gone home that night without inviting him in? Think of what they would have missed. He would have remained a stranger, and they would not have had the joy of the resurrection. This reminds us that God will never coerce us or take away our freedom to choose the path that we will take in our lives. Whichever road we decide to travel, it is ours to choose. And so they say to Jesus, "Stay with us." Our scripture tells us that once they were seated at the supper table, Jesus takes bread, blesses it and breaks it, and gives it to them. And it's such a small thing, everything changes. Their eyes are opened and they recognize who Jesus is. I shared in my little newsletter article this week about how difficult it is, it seems, for us to be sheltering in place of this. Sometimes I think we lose our focus or our vision. It's narrowed so much. I think that it becomes hard for us to see and to embrace the transformative power of the small things that happen in our lives. And if nothing else, this Emmaus story tells us that there is much to be experienced in a bit of bread and a common table and a shared meal. But the Emmaus story also shows us that there is power in the small and commonplace, because those are the places where God is revealed to us. You see, God shows up during the quiet walk on a backwater road. God is made known to us in a simple meal at a table. God reveals God's self when we take and bless and give. God is present in the rhythms and rituals of our seemingly ordinary, boring days. So what does this mean for us now? Well, I think it means that God is in the text that you send to your neighbor or friend that you can't visit during this quarantine. I think it says that God is in the Zoom gatherings, in the recorded worship that we do, that God is in the phone calls and the greeting cards and all of those things that we do to keep in touch. And I believe that the sacred is in the conversations that we have with our stir-crazy housemates. And I think that it means that the sacred is in the attempts that we have to master technology so that we can talk to friends across the country. If the Emmaus story tells us anything, it is that the risen Christ isn't going to be confined in any of the seemingly smallness and small things of our lives. That whenever and wherever we make room, Jesus appears. And so we need to keep walking those out-of-the-way roads. We need to keep telling the story of Jesus' resurrection. We need to keep honoring the stranger and inviting them in. We need to keep being hospitable, and we need to keep paying attention to the things that warm our hearts. And we need to keep attention to and pay attention to the small things of our lives where God is revealed. You see, because Christ is no less risen today than he was more than 2,000 years ago. And so we need to keep listening for Jesus.